We are live. Good morning, Tanner.
Hello, hello.
Hey, so Tanner, quick introduction to you because I want to kick into this topic and I'm really excited about it. Tanner, previously just left great company at Gem, head of design, building that design function up and help that company grow to like what 45 million annual revenue. Fantastic. Previous to that, right, working with Lyft, working on internal tools for autonomous driving. Worked on Facebook's bread and butter with their ad platform for something like 4 years, I think, right? Also working at Atlassian, helping take their products to mobile. So lots of experience in the space, lots of passion, lots of experience in terms of probably helping make hiring decisions. I've got to imagine, I think, and in fact, I even found you at one point on LinkedIn. Was like an engagement point where I was like, hey, I'm trying to figure out how to make some hiring decisions for a company I was working with. And so I want to paint the picture here, starting this topic of how do we make ourselves as designers ideal candidates. I think from a lot of the advice out there, one of the perspectives that I don't think gets talked about enough is thinking about this question in terms of the hiring manager's point of view. And this really hit home for me when I started to find myself in that seat. When I'm gonna paint the picture, a scenario. I'm gonna paint one specific scenario for me and shape of work that I've seen. I want you to paint a picture as well, and let's kind of like talk about this perspective there. I'll start. So I once got turned down from Reddit years ago, and the hiring manager there walked out of the room mid interview.
What?
Yeah, it was terrible. I mean, I don't think it's the right way to do it, and I was devastated at the time. So that's an example of where I clearly bombed a whiteboarding session. But today, it's a little more understandable. It's not. I don't think it's an acceptable way to do it, but it's a little more understandable. So let me flip it in the other side. I'm a hiring manager at a mid market company, Series C investment. I'm building up the design team. I'm trying to instill design culture. We're not what you might consider a design destination company yet, but that's what I'm aspiring to build this into. So my calendar booked. Just I mean, it's like, where can I even find individual contributor time? Because while I'm a hiring manager, I'm also the IC, right? And I'm spread across 4 different product teams, trying to like meet really tight timelines, as well as build context, advocate, do all the things that we do. And then all of a sudden I switch context. I come out of like a super, like, we're a meeting where we're banging our head against the wall and we're trying to figure out how to do it fast. And then I switch gears. I quickly pull up my notes. I'm like, okay, this is what I saw from this candidate's like portfolio. This is what like our third party recruiting said. And in Hire Hive, the tool we're using, these were the notes that were taken. Okay, like, let me quickly shift context. Boom, camera on. Hey, how's it going? And we immediately kick into it. And it's like, that's where I'm coming from. When you sit down, not you, but a designer sits down in front of me, I am trying to suppress all the fires that seem to be like, you see the smoke in the background. And I'm like, no, we're totally a fantastic place to work and I'm going to take care of you. And we need your help. Can you help us?
Mhm.
That's the scene I'm going to paint from my experience. What about you?
Yeah. Oh my gosh. I'll start also with a rejection here. Um, man, so my career is very, very long, very windy. I didn't get into design for actually many years in my career. It took a while to get into design. So I remember getting one of my first interviews at Dropbox. And it was the first time I had ever been in like Silicon Valley in San Francisco. And I remember going into the interview and just not having any idea around what was going to happen. And I remember going into the interview, and honestly, I don't even know who the hiring manager was at the time. Like, I don't think they ever told me like this is the person who's going to be making the decision. They just like went through a process of portfolio presentation and then a design exercise. And I had never even done a design exercise at that point in my career. I didn't even know what it was. And so I think right after the design exercise, which was the second interview in a day that was supposed to be 5 interviews, the recruiter I'd been working with came up to me and said, "It's not working out. Let's piece you out of here." They had flown me out from Utah, where I'm originally from, to San Francisco for this interview process. And within two rounds of this larger day, they were like, "It's not working out. Good luck to you." And I remember thinking at the time, wow, interviewing here is extremely different than what I'm used to. At that point in my career, I was used to just having a casual chat with one or two people at a company, getting to know each other, and then we made it work. But design interviews, particularly at a company like Dropbox, they were way more intensive. And
Mm.
so that was like my first real experience in the recruiting space and in the design world and interviewing. Fast forward many, many years, I've done a lot of different things. At Gem, where I was the hiring manager responsible for building out a design team from scratch, I got to see that other side of things. And like you said, everything you said completely resonates with me. You're leaving a meeting and everything's on fire, and there's an executive who's trying to get something solved, and you're panicking, and but you have to show a great face and convince the person on the other side that this is good. That this fire is actually, it's not a bad fire. It's a fire that we're here to solve and try to figure out. So my experience has been trying to be very transparent and clear. In some cases, as a hiring manager, I would even communicate, hey, I just got out of this really hectic meeting. I just want you to know where my headspace is at. Let's talk about you. But I think everything you said really resonates with me. It really, really aligns with me. The objective of those interviews as a hiring manager is you want to understand the candidate. You want to understand where they're coming from and their skills. You want to make sure your headspace is in a great position. And I think one of the critical criteria to make an interview successful is having transparency and honesty on both sides.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And like there's we're going to speak a lot, I think, to, the design candidate part of this. But I think in the industry as a whole, there's a lot of education needed on both sides. Like as a company, as new design leadership or the absence of design leadership, like what should we be asking candidates to really make sure we have enough information to move forward? I remember finding myself a couple of times in a situation where like we put a candidate through a couple of phone calls and we did the things that we felt were, getting checks and input. And then I'm sitting there going, I like them and I like this and I like that, but I don't know if I have enough information to say, let's move forward. And part of that's my fault. It's like, did I not set myself up with the right rubric? Did I not approach the conversation in the right way? And now I have to make a decision that it's not necessarily that they're not a right fit. It's that I don't know if I have enough information and I don't know if I've exhausted all the time that I have to make the decision. Therefore, I guess not. Right.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And so I'm curious, like, what do you think about on the hiring manager side, some of the things that we should be thinking about when we go into those candidate interviews?
Yeah, man. Again, quite everything you're saying completely resonates with me. I think you're nailing it. As a hiring manager, I think it's really critical to do a few things. If you're a first-time hiring manager, you have to embrace those situations where you're not sure if the problem or the issue is you don't have enough information, if the candidate has not given you the right information, if their communication is poor, if your communication is poor. You have to kind of embrace that. In some cases, you'll have to just take the risk. I think what really, really helps in those situations, though, is the panel. There's a reason we have multi-step interviews, right? Where you have cross-functional interviews with a product manager or an engineer or someone in marketing. There's a reason you have a panel of interviewers when you're doing like an on-site loop or a portfolio presentation. So as a hiring manager, you really need to listen to people on those interview loops to dig into, well, I didn't get this sense that this person, communicated well. Did someone else pick up signal one way or the other toward that end? So really relying on the interviewing pool that you have, I think that really makes the job easier. The other thing, which I'm honestly surprised more companies really struggle with, you have to make sure that your expectations, your perspective of what you're trying to hire is vivid. I see way too many companies who are like, oh, we're looking for a designer, but we don't really know if they should be senior or if they should be more mid-level. Maybe we want a head of design. We're not sure. So we're just going to talk to candidates and see what they tell us. And that's a huge red flag in my mind. You should have some sense of the responsibilities that this person may have, the need that they'll have to solve. So you can optimize your interviewing and your question asking toward that end.
I remember hearing one proposal. Let's just, we copied this job description from, Facebook or from big tech. And I'm like, oh, that's scary. So we haven't actually thought about what we need today. Like, well, no, we need a designer. Okay, but what do we need like in the next 3 to 6 months? And then maybe what might that grow into 12 to 16 months from now, right?
Exactly.
And so in your mind, there's a lot of conversation like take home assignments and whiteboarding exercises, the panel. What do you think is the one of the better formats in 2022 for evaluating design talent?
I think it's the same thing that has been around for a very long time, which is just the casual one-on-one conversation with a hiring manager.
Mhm.
I do think there's still immense value in things like portfolio presentations with a panel of interviewers. I think there's value in whiteboarding exercises. I think there's value in even take-home assignments in some capacity. We can talk about that later. Um, but nothing really beats just an hour long, if possible, one-on-one conversation between a hiring manager, someone who's responsible and understands the role, and a candidate. Getting to know the person, what their ambitions are, what their strengths are, how they present themselves and communicate. I think the key there though is casual, like kind of almost off the record. Let's have a human to human chat about what your experience is like, what our business needs, where the two overlap. I don't think there's any replacement for that real casual conversation.
And I think if you're actively listening and you're a hiring manager, I'm sure there are people who can pass, the bullshit radar, and you find out after the fact, oh wow, they really didn't, they got me. But I think for the most part, like when you have those casual conversations with someone, and let's say it's more for like a senior role, you can tell in an hour conversation if they've really worked on deep seated, long product life cycle challenges and what that's looked like. Because I mean, for the most part, at least my experience is like you can only really bullshit that so long, right?
Yes.
Disagree?
I don't disagree. I think I slightly agree. And the reason for that is um, interviewing, it's like I always relate it to dating. I know a lot of people hate that. So I'm trying to think of other ones like adopting a pet or um, really anything. Like you want as much information as you can get. And I think that goes both ways for the record. I think candidates really need to pursue as much information about the company and the culture and the role. But as a hiring manager, you really need a lot of information. And so I think again that one-on-one casual conversation is just a great way to get that early rapport with each other, build that relationship, get an understanding. But you also have to pair that with tangibles, meaning show me the work, show me what you've done before. Let me see or hear kind of what you've done. I don't think it's quite enough just to rely on someone's word. And the reason I say that is not because people bullshit all the time. The reason I say that is because some people just get nervous in interviews.
Yeah.
Some people are poor communicators. Some people are excellent communicators. So I think you need to kind of balance all those things out with the tangible artifacts and multi-stepped interviews.
So you've kind of talked about on the hiring manager side, questions centered around like experience based, like show me a time you did that. Let's look at the work and dig into that. And I think as hiring managers, I agree with you. We have to kind of on the fly figure out, is this person just, maybe nervous right now a little bit, and how can I kind of help this situation to extract the most information I need in this short window. On the other side of that, now that everyone's kind of understanding that even on the hiring manager side, there's things that the candidate may need to compensate for. What are some questions? And I know this gets asked a lot, and there's like cookie cutter type stuff, but truly, what are some questions you think a candidate can ask a hiring manager, whether or not they sense like the need to compensate for something?
Can you reword that question for me?
Yeah, basically, what can a candidate ask a hiring manager to make sure that they're getting all the information that person
Hmm.
needs to make an informed decision?
Yeah, that's really hard, honestly, because it's a little bit of a not a catch 22, but similar in that during the interview process, you want to make sure you as a candidate are giving the right information, but you also don't want to over index your answers on what the company's looking for. And the reason for that is you want
Mm,
to make sure that it's a mutual healthy relationship. It's a good fit. Fit is such a negative term, I think, but you really want to make sure that as a candidate, you'll be able to thrive in the role. And as a hiring manager, you want to also make sure the person can not only thrive, but support the business. And if you're giving away too much information, if you're essentially setting up the questions and answers, it's like you're not going to get that authentic signal. And so you may end up in a situation where, as a candidate, you checked all the boxes in the interview, but on the job, you're maybe struggling. You don't have really the skills necessary. So it's really tricky to kind of figure that out. I think that's part of why interviewing is such a hard subject, right? Is It's this balancing act where you don't want to pivot too much on one way or the other. Go ahead.
No. What I was going to highlight something you had said, which was interesting to me, which was you don't really want to tailor to the company's, what they're looking for. And that's counter to what the perspective I've started to build and even practice, which every time I get back onto the market, I have my slide deck and I tweak it. I tweak it every single time I'm back on the market. And I go to tweak it. And first I tweak it kind of holistically. Like, I think there's a better way just in general to tell this story if I were to tell it my way. And then there might be a couple of roles I'm interested in. And based on what those roles seem to be looking for with the limited information available, the job description, or maybe the first phone call, I may like emphasize visually and on a couple of slides a specific part of that work that maybe I didn't include in the last time. So I'm interested. You say, don't do that. What is your thinking around that?
So that's not quite what I said.
Okay. Sorry.
No. I think you're giving a great example here. What I heard you say that you do, and what I do as well if I'm on the job market, and what I would encourage anyone to do, is first of all, do some research as a candidate. Go figure out what the company is about. Oh, sorry, can you still hear me here?
We can hear you. I still got you. Yep.
My camera cut out there for a second. Let me see if I can change that real quick.
No worries.
Okay. Switch cameras here. Yeah, my camera is gone. Oh, there we go.
Got you back.
Okay, sorry about that. So what I heard you say, and what I really encourage anyone to do, is you have experience in specific areas that these companies are looking for. So if you go and you read a job description, and you go and kind of research the company, and you kind of can figure out, okay, they're looking for this type of designer or this type of work. Yeah, you should tailor your presentation, your resume, your LinkedIn, honestly, even your social media to kind of say, I have skills that you're looking for. What I don't think designers should do, which I often hear designers do, is try to tailor their resume or online experience to experience they do not have. Meaning, if you are like a product designer, you have kind of experience in visual design, interaction design, and product strategy, but maybe you're lacking research experience. You haven't done a lot of hands-on research. And yet you're seeing a lot of job posts that say, we want you to do research. Do not go to your resume and say, I love research. Like I'm excellent at research. That is not an optimization that's going to benefit you, right? You're kind of being misleading. It may get you a foot in the door. You may get a chance to have that interview process. You may go through the loop, but it's not you being honest. It's kind of forcing your way in based on what you've seen. So I think, again, here for candidates, a balancing act. You need to do the research, which is something that I really wish more candidates would do. Understand the company. See what keywords they use in their job posts and their branding and things, and see what experiences you authentically have related to those kind of phrases and experiences in the job posting, and use those. So I think that is actually a great step to do. What I see way too many designers do, however, is add keywords, like keyword stuffing, the old like search engine optimization approach,
Right.
keyword stuffing and all those kind of things. And it's just not honest, and it's not going to help you in the long run. And it's not going to help the company either.
So what I'm hearing is essentially look for the areas that you can help a company, do research, and I'm going to jump back to that in just a second, but double down on the things you have experience with that you can demonstrate, and kind of stay away from the things that, they need someone with design system experience. Well, we didn't really work on that over here. I'm not going to stuff that keyword in there and try to emphasize that, because that sets me up for failure.
Yes. The one additional caveat to that point, I would say, is if it's an area that you're not experienced in, but you are excited about, you can say that, right? Don't say, I don't have design experience or design system experience. Don't say, I do have design system experience. What you can say is, I have all these skills, which I see overlap with your job post, for example. I do not have design system experience, but I'm really excited about that area. I want to learn and grow in that area for XYZ reasons. That way, again, you're being very honest with the company. You're checking the box on some of the keywords that they use. And now you can have a real honest conversation about where you're at, your skills, and what the company can do to help you in your career, as well as vice versa.
I love that preemptive approach a lot. And I think that it goes back to what you were saying of starting transparently and having that open and honest conversation. I realized the value in that just as myself as a candidate, but even more so on the hiring manager side, because, I want to make sure we're not wasting each other's time. And that's why when I go back to that Reddit situation, don't agree with how it was handled, but I kind of understand why maybe there was some frustration. They're like, this is not going to work. I gotta go. And it was like, okay, I get that like the fires are just huge over there, maybe. Um, but and that brings me to the point of when we're in the hiring manager seat and we look at let's say a public portfolio, or even we're in the middle of a presentation. I've noticed that when we start to look at these things and we see, hundreds over time, right? There start to be like trends and red flags that we can pick up. There might be some bias in there. I'm fairly certain there probably is. For me, it's if I see the pretty like cookie cutter, if I see somebody try to fit a recent piece of work into what looks like a very standardized design thinking flow, I'm like, oh, here we go. I feel like I'm gonna have what that at least tells me. It's not to say the project and the product didn't unfold that way, but what it does tell me is I may have to do some pretty manual digging to understand this story. What are some red flags that you look out for that you see that maybe people can avoid?
Yeah, I'm going to reiterate what you just said because I think that's one of the biggest ones. I've tweeted about it before. I've shared content about this before. When designers have like a case study on their website or their digital portfolio that feels almost crammed into some kind of process, the double diamond, for example, if you're familiar with that, is a common one where it's like, here was the problem, here was the business problem, here was the team, here's what we did first, here's the research we did, here's the sticky notes on the whiteboard, et cetera, et cetera. That is always a huge red flag for me because no process actually works that way. I have never worked with a designer. I've never worked on a team where we go through and check all those boxes, right? It just doesn't work that way. And so whenever I, as a hiring manager, see a design portfolio that kind of has these very linear steps, immediately I'm just like, okay, this is either a very junior designer or they just haven't invested the time to really articulate what their actual process was. So that is absolutely a very glaring red flag for me. Don't try to have a linear process. Instead, just tell me the authentic, true story of what happened. Where did the project start? What happened? Walk me through that. If you didn't do research, that's okay. I mean, maybe that's just not part of your process. That's okay. But how did you move through the project? That's what I want to know. Go ahead.
No. Sorry, go ahead.
Another one is very controversial, but I love to kind of talk about it lately because I think it's really important. Anytime I see in a portfolio case study a list of skills, a list of team members, things like here was my role on the team, that stuff is red flags to me. That's very, very junior. And here's what I mean by that. I do want to know the skills you incorporated in a project. I do want to know who you worked with in a project. But when you list them out as like a bulleted list or at the top of a case study, that does not tell me how you worked with that person or how you utilize those skills. When you have like a bulleted list of skills, like on your resume or in a case study, when you have a list of team members, you could just Google like who do designers work with and then create a bulleted list, right? So instead, what designers need to do in their portfolio is find a way to organically talk about who you actually worked with. Saying, I worked on this project with 12 engineers. Did you actually work with those 12 engineers or did you work with 2 of them very closely, right? I'm much more interested in the latter case where you can tell me I worked with these 2 engineers, I walked over to their desk and I delivered designs to them and we went back and forth on these projects and things. That is way more interesting and compelling and tells me about your process than something that's like, I worked with 12 engineers, which you may or may not have actually done. So those are 2 big red flags. Again, having a templated kind of case study and then kind of listing out your team and your skills.
Yeah. No, I love that. And on the flip side of that, what are things that stand out to you that you would advocate other designers do that are good characteristics of like a portfolio case study?
For a good portfolio case study, again, I'm going to reiterate, kind of echo myself here, just authenticity. I want to hear your story, your perspective of the work. And what I mean by that is I don't need to understand the business you worked with. which I see designers do a lot too much. Like they have paragraphs and paragraphs around here's the business and here was the business problem. Honestly, I don't care. And that context does not matter. What I care about as a hiring manager is hearing your perspective of the work. So when was the first time you kind of figured out this was a project? Did someone just tell you to do the work? That's okay. That's totally fine. Or were you doing experiments and stuff? And then once you found out the project was going to happen, what did you do first? And not only tell me what you did first, but how did you feel? Were you intimidated? Were you scared? Were you excited? And why? And then just go through the story as if, the way I always tell designers, talk to me as if you were talking to a friend. You went to a restaurant or a bar or a late night drinking some tea, and you're sitting down with a friend. Talk to me as if you were telling them about your work, because that's the narrative that a hiring manager wants to hear. What really happened? How did you feel? What was hard? Was there someone you worked with that like you really just hated working with? I want to hear that. Not only do I want to hear that, I want to hear what you did in that situation, because what's going to happen is you're going to encounter people that are difficult to work with. You're going to encounter problems that are exciting or frightening for you in any job. If you can tell me that you have experiences doing those things, that's exactly what I want to hear. I don't care if you did like affinity diagrams. That means almost nothing to me. What matters to me is how did you make sense of a problem space and communicate that problem space to your peers? So that authentic story, anytime I hear like almost like a blog post or like a podcast episode of someone's case study, that is beautiful. I will read that, right?
I've heard you talk about this before, and it's really become kind of a bullet point that I try to highlight for designers as well. Because storytelling is hard. We're going to crack into storytelling a little bit in a couple more minutes here. But one of the things about storytelling that I think designers and just people get wrong is like they gloss over the most interesting part of the story, which is the drama, right?
Yeah.
Like what went wrong? What were some assumptions maybe you or your team had going into this that you spent some resources on and then found out wrong direction and it caused this conflict, and then there was resolute, like let's talk about that and try to find that in that story, in that journey for that product. Find those little moments of drama, and that's going to make for, I think, sometimes a more authentic and compelling way to talk about your work.
Yeah. Again, you're spot on. And not only is that more compelling, I think it's easier to come up with, right? Because if you're just thinking, well, what was really hard about that project? You're probably going to have an answer. If you are thinking to yourself, what was really exciting? What energized me about that project? That's way easier to answer than, well, tell me about like this blasé process that you're going to try to match your experience to. That's not authentic. That's hard. You have to kind of, it's work, right? So when I hear designers talk about, I got to build a portfolio or I have to build a presentation, it's so much work. It is work, undoubtedly. But if you're just telling your story, it's a lot less work than trying to like fabricate some case study, right?
Something you say too, that I really agree with, is that these interviews are not tests, and they're conversations. And really, when you take that frame of mind to these interviews, I think it allows you to kind of push through. Maybe if you're somebody who feels insecure or you get nervous in these moments, like you said, talk about it like you're talking with a friend. There is an element of evaluation happening, and I think that you can't just ignore that because you are trying to sell yourself to a degree. But I would say, and would you agree with this? Conversation first, evaluation second.
Yeah, let me think here. You're totally right that there's still some evaluation. I think that, so let me take an less privileged stance than what I have been fortunate to have in my life. Let's say you're someone who you need a job. You've got bills coming in. Maybe you have people that you're taking care of. Interviewing is going to be stressful. You need that job. And so you're going to approach those conversations as, how do I impress? How do I pass the test? How do I give them the answers they're looking for? There's a lot of pressure on me. I need to do that. I think in those situations, that mentality, those perspectives are clearly not wrong. But what's going to help you more is if you say, how do I find the right place for me? Where not only can I pay my bills and get a paycheck, but also grow and thrive and build a career and help the company too, right? And you're not going to be able to have that perspective if all you're focused on is, how do I pass the test? You're going to be way too anxious, way too stressed. You may get a job. It may be the worst job you've ever had because you were trying to check those boxes. So instead, approaching these conversations by saying, yeah, I need a job as a candidate, for example, but I want to make sure it's the right job. I want to make sure I can not only get those paychecks, but I can keep those paychecks coming. I want to make sure that I'm building a career. And the way you're going to do that is by approaching the interviews, the interview process, again, as a conversation. How do I get to know these people? How do I help them really understand who I am, what I struggle with, what I'm great with? And then on the inverse side, from the hiring manager perspective, it's the same thing. You want to hire candidates. You need people to do the work. The business cannot grow unless there are designers doing the work. But similarly, you don't want to mislead them. You don't want to hire someone who thought they were coming into the most dreamy design job only to find out no one likes designers at the company, right? So you also want to approach it from a very conversational perspective. Let me get to know about you, and let me tell you about us. I'm going to tell you about what's going great and what's hard. And I'm going to tell you what we hope you can come in and help us fulfill. And if it seems like those two things overlap, that's a match. Let's make it happen, right? If it's not a match, that's okay. Maybe you're just not the right person for that job. It doesn't mean you're a bad designer. It doesn't mean it's a bad company. It just means it's not a great match. That's why we go through interviewing.
Yeah, that was a great call out. And one of the things I really appreciated too was the call out on privilege. One of the privileges, I think, as you grow in your career and you start to work with more mature companies, more interesting problem spaces, those are a lot easier to talk about in a portfolio. But if for example, from when I first started, the kind of work that I had to talk about was far less interesting, typically for immature product organizations that didn't have infrastructure for measuring outcome, where there was even dysfunction in regards to collaboration. There were people who were fulfilling multiple roles. And when you get into those types of environments and then you go to move to another role, how do you talk about that work? How do you talk about dysfunction? Maybe there was some like actual toxic behavior, but you want to salvage the work you did there. How do you talk about that?
I love this question. Just thinking off the top of my head here, I think there's a perspective here that is pervasive in our industry, which is also not good, which is when you're building a case study in a portfolio or in a conversation with a hiring manager or a recruiter, the company you worked for, even the projects you worked on, they don't really matter. Like they just don't. What matters is you, your perspective, your experience. So whether you're like a new student, like a new grad coming out of university and you don't have too much work, or you worked at a company where they just didn't have a lot of design maturity and it was kind of hard, those are compelling stories, right? I want to hear about your experience in university. What did you do to get other students to see your perspective? That's something you're going to have to do on a day job, right? In the instance of working at a company that is, immature or kind of frustrating to work on, well, how did you manage that? How did you stay sane? I want to hear about that. Because if you come to my company, for example, you hopefully will have a much better time, but I'll also know that you're the kind of person who can think deeply about these situations and navigate them in order to try to get to some outcome. So it really comes down to that personal perspective, that personal narrative, that story that you tell, because you can make anything a really interesting story if you focus on yourself and your growth and your experience. And after all, that's what people are interviewing you for, right? I'm not interviewing your other company and figuring out how they grew and figured out their immaturity issues. I'm interviewing you to know what you did to grow and thrive and succeed, or just like learn new things. Like that's what I want to hear. So if you can focus on that in your story, it doesn't matter what work you did.
And I think there's ways that you can compensate for the lack of certain things. And you probably don't want your portfolio or your presentation to lean or rely heavily on that. But for example, what do you think about in the absence of like really good instrumentation? You have no idea to know if what you shipped was performant. Well, you can say that, and you can go in and break down what you would have liked to have measured and how you would have thought about it should you have had that instrumentation. I think that's a totally valid answer, right? Would you agree with that?
Absolutely. I hear often from designers. In fact, I think there was a thread on the Shape community not long ago of someone who said, I've been asked to report on the metrics of my work, and we didn't track any metrics at my last company. I have zero idea what that even means. What do I do? Again, here, the prompt should be, well, what were your metrics for the work? How did you know that your job was being successful or not? What did you look at? And then beyond that, to your point, what do you, in hindsight, what would you do differently? What have you learned since that project or since that job? What do you think would be interesting to look at? Is it conversion rate? Is it active users? Is it some internal metric? That's the kind of stuff that companies want to hear. So you're totally right. If you haven't done something if you have not experienced something, but you've reflected on it, that is just almost just as valuable as sharing an authentic experience, right? I've thought about this. I really wish in hindsight we had done X, Y, Z. Moving forward, I would love to explore that space. Man, that's exciting. That tells me that as a hiring manager, you're thoughtful, you're intentional, and potentially my company can help you grow in those ways.
And I want candidates also to recognize that design hiring managers, from my experience, like can really empathize with when you have to talk about work. We've seen a lot of different shapes of work. We understand that there are nuances that maybe aren't making their way through this particular presentation. So I think some of that can kind of help you. But going to your point, so shape, and we really haven't talked a lot about shape, and I think shape's a really interesting thing that this industry really needs right now. Shape is something you only recently left your full-time role to go full-time as the founder of. But if I'm not mistaken, this has almost been like 5 years in the making, right?
That's right. My wife and I, Jasmine Friedel, she's a senior like head of design at Dropbox Design. Um, about 5 or 6 years ago, we were both working at Facebook together, and we realized that the knowledge we were gaining at Facebook way back when was almost foreign to most designers we were talking to. They just didn't understand the realm that we were working in terms of design systems, product thinking, product strategy, interaction design, all those things. So we built a program called Shape to try to educate designers on how to think like modern product designers. And it was really fun those years ago. We got a few cohorts through. They're all working at great companies now like Uber and Twitter, Buffer, some great people. And so that was really fun. But after a while, we said, look, this doesn't scale. We're not sure we want to do the cohort-based product design thing. There's a lot of resources out there. So we kind of experimented with a number of things over the years. And then most recently, over the last, I'd say, year for me, I've talked to many designers, probably 500 designers in one-on-one consultations. And what has become very apparent to me is designers just don't know how to interview. Almost every single one of the consultations I was doing with designers was about, how do I present my work? How do I tell a compelling story? And so I said, let me take that Shape model, that Shape kind of experience, and build this interviewing platform to help designers. And then also something we're going to launch in the coming months is, how do we help hiring managers and recruiters and startups build better hiring practices for designers as well?
Oh, wow. That's huge. That latter half excites me a whole lot. But that former half that you're talking about, because I think you're invite only right now. Is that correct?
That's right. Yes.
Yeah. And so like what is that actually? I'm really curious, because it's no secret to anybody that we're seeing and I think this is a good thing. We're seeing an influx of design talent entering the market, and there seems to be like bridge building happening that's not quite there yet to connect all this supply with the demand. So what are you seeing coming into the doors of this Shape community? Is it a community based thing? Is this something that you're are you building what do you call them? Are you building, not curriculums, are you building like matrices? How are you helping people understand how to be better storytellers?
Yeah. So right now, for anyone listening, you can Google a lot of the things that you need to learn as a designer on how to interview, right? Like there's tons of information out there, a lot of videos, articles, and things like that. So what Shape is offering is something that I'm calling like a hybrid, where if you join Shape, you get access to expert created and curated guides. So these are just essentially articles. They also come in audio format. You can download them and read them on your e-reader, whatever, which are regularly audited by a number of my peers in the industry who do recruiting and hiring. And like it gives you the overview of, well, why do you need a resume? What is the point of a resume? And how do you build a really strong resume? How do you build an online presence to get noticed? How do you apply to these jobs effectively? All the way through, like, how do you negotiate your salary if you get an offer? So those are the guides. The other side of Shape is something you cannot get anywhere else, which is a community. It's a community of very heavily moderated conversations between designers who want to interview better and well, and experts. So a lot of hiring managers, a lot of VPs of design. I think we just got a CDO, Chief Design Officer, who joined and are contributing and engaging. So that's the first step of Shape, is the bridge between expert curated content and organic community conversations that are really focused on interviewing. And then in the future, looking forward for the next year or so, we're going to do that hiring manager perspective and start bridging the gap between those two communities, meaning you're a designer who's trying to interview better. You're a hiring manager who has a job and you're trying to find the right candidates and interview them exceptionally well. Shape is going to connect those two audiences and do a little bit of the hard work to identify the right fit, more or less, for other people. And then beyond that, beyond the next year, hopefully, if things go well, we'll begin expanding even further to content strategists and researchers and all those kind of things.
That's fantastic. I wish this had been around when I sorely needed it. I'm sure when I'm back in the practitioner seat, not focusing so much on the content side, that this is something that I would benefit from. But that hiring, that I'm really excited because so many companies
Yes.
need education on how to hire. And I
Yeah.
really like Facebook's hiring approach because their recruiters are so informed and they will walk you through on how to be successful. And so I like to call that out. I like to see when companies are just well-informed entities and they know how to, like, they want to see their candidates succeed. And there's so much I think that can be learned inside of that.
Yep.
Going back to the storytelling piece though, and this is something that's come up for me. You go into a live presentation, right? And you're about to talk about your work. And you've been in the weeds of this thing. It's like, okay, but I got to build some context. I got to set the stage. How much context or stage setting is appropriate? And when is someone maybe going too far into the context and you need to start getting to the meat?
Yeah. So when I was consulting with a lot of designers on their portfolio presentation, this was probably one of the biggest issues I saw. Designers would spend, they've got 30, 45, maybe an hour with the interview panel, and they're spending 10, 15 minutes talking about the business they worked at. And the perspective makes sense, right? I worked at this company. You've never heard of it before. Let me tell you a little bit about where they came from and what they were doing. I'm going to set the stage. And what I always tell designers in this situation is it just doesn't matter. That context does not matter. The reason it doesn't matter is because all I care about is you and your experience working through the project. So if you really feel like you need to set up some context, I would say if you're doing a presentation, you need a single slide. And don't have a bunch of text on the slide. Just say, here's the company, here's what they do. And then move on to your story. Here's my part of the story, right? And go on. The other thing that I always tell designers is if the audience has questions or they're not sure what you're talking about, they'll ask you. Give them space to ask you questions. Let them interject with uncertainties. But what you'll find is more often than not, they just don't care. Like, they want to know what you did on a specific usability issue, for example, or how you solved the problem. They don't need to know all of the context of the problem. They need to know enough to understand that it was a problem, and then you work through it. The other thing is in my mind, it's very clear. Don't use lingo. Don't use acronyms that they're not going to know. Just be very explicit, as if, again, you were talking to a close friend. What would you tell a close friend if you sat down and said, let me tell you about my day at work? You only have half an hour to tell them. What are you going to tell them? You're not going to spend 15 minutes giving them a history of this company, right? You're going to tell them about you and the project and all those things. And if you take that perspective, your presentation will be much more concise, much more direct. And like any conversation, if there are questions, people will interject and ask, hopefully.
Brevity is such a heck of a design challenge. And especially for someone like me, I am so verbose. Creating content on TikTok has become such a weird, interesting challenge to cram the most important bits and to make decisions on what to leave out. I empathize with people who have a hard time doing that because I do as well. And by the way, in a few minutes here, we're going to be answering some questions. If anyone has questions, you've already submitted some, feel free to start dropping them in. Freddie's going to be taking note of those, and Tanner and I are going to be answering them here shortly. Stories, though. Some folks, and I think the longer you've been in the field, the longer projects, the longer life cycles you have to pull from. But there are a lot of designers out there who've been doing maybe some agency work where it's high volume, low cycle, right? Or you've only got a couple of stories to talk about, and they're not particularly long life cycle. What kind of advice would you give to somebody who's trying to figure out how to tell compelling stories about really short life cycle work?
This is another really great question. What my perspective here is, you can make a very long story out of anything at all. And what I often talk to designers about is if you did minuscule work, let me come up with an example. Let's say you had an internship and you only designed one screen, like a login screen for a company, or not even a login screen, a welcome screen, like a one page screen for a mobile app. Not a lot of work goes into that typically. You can still make that a really compelling and interesting story by, again, focusing on you and your journey through that single project, right? If you were an intern, if it was like the first project you worked on, again, here you need to elaborate on, well, how did you feel when you first encountered that project? Maybe your perspective was like, wow, a single page, how hard could this be? Okay, now you've got a really interesting start to your story, right? Because if you go into an interview and you say, I'm going to talk about this project today, and here it was, a single page project. And my first thought when I got told this was my project, I said, this cannot be that hard. And then you pause and you say, little did I know, right? And then you go into your narrative. And again, if you focus on yourself, I want to hear about the challenges you faced, the explorations you did. You can really make anything as detailed as you want. Talk about some of the competitor screens that you looked at, for example, in this example story. Tell me about what you liked, what you didn't like, the details. Did you go to your manager and talk about some of those things? What were those conversations like? Did you do a lot of iterations? Why? What were in those iterations? Or did you do a few iterations? And if you only did a few, well, why? Again, and then what did you learn from that experience? Like, you can make a narrative out of anything. One of the best examples I can share with you was from a very senior product designer at a relatively known company who, just for whatever reason, the last few years, his projects have been like, change this toggle to a checkbox. And he was able to take something as simple and subtle as that change, take a toggle, make it a checkbox, and turn it into a full-blown case study where he talks about the history of checkboxes and why certain narratives make sense in people's heads around checkboxes versus toggles, and how to approach those things. I mean, he turned that simple problem into a half an hour presentation that was really interesting and demonstrates to interviewers how he thinks deeply about design decisions and intentionality and the psychological effects of something like that kind of subtle, the color differences and the shape and what that conveys and the system impact across the business. Like, I could go on for hours about that stuff. So the question again is, think about your experience and that narrative you can tell around that project.
That's a fantastic example. I love that a lot. Now, on the opposite side, and then we're going to take some questions after this last question I have. For the long life cycle work, and you've been at a company for 2 years, and you've seen multiple iterations and all this, and you sit down to create the case study, and you're like, oh, where do I even begin? I don't know what was what. How do you set yourself up for success to tell long form stories or tell a story on a long life cycle project?
I'll interpret this as specifically for being an in-person, face-to-face kind of presentation or narrative. The reason I say that is because I think when it comes to like writing a case study on a website or something, you always have the option of expanding in other realms. So actually, let me quickly touch on that briefly. What I mean by that is, if you're a designer building your website or a digital portfolio, focus on the meat of that project, and then give recruiters and hiring managers some optionality to go deeper, right? A different website, a different web page, a blog post where you really can go deep into it. I think you have like infinite amount of time and space when it comes to writing, as long as you like make it links, for example. But when it comes to presenting really lengthy case studies, here again, my advice is focus on what mattered most to you. What really impacted you? What excited you the most? You could have this massive case study where you've been working on a single project for more than a year, 2 years, right? And the interesting aspects that are going to be what comes to memory for you. And so you can start your story there. You can say, look, I was doing this project for a year, but I want to dive into this one specific part of it. I want to start here, this journey where my product manager and I had this really big difference of opinion, and that's where our story is going to start. So let's talk about that. Like, that's exactly what interviewers want to hear. The contention, the difficulties, the excitement, what you really just knocked out of the park. That is the stuff you need to focus on. And it's, again, going back to my previous point, it should be easier to tell those stories and build a case study around those stories because they're what excites you. They're what's most interesting to you. And if it's interesting to you, that energy, that enthusiasm, that frustration, that learning, that's going to carry over to the recruiter, the hiring manager, the interviewer, right? And that's exactly what we want to hear. So you don't need to give a whole rundown of the 2 years of project. Like, honestly, no one wants to hear that anyway. Tell me the interesting parts that you think are interesting, or, and if you can, try to figure out what the company wants to hear about. If one part of that two-year project was working with a design system team, and you know that the company you're interviewing with has a design system kind of need, you can talk about that, right?
You talk about the work, keeping a work journal a lot too in the past, and that's something that will forever be in my tool belt is tracking my work as I'm going along, so that I don't really have to hold it all in memory. I can like
Yeah.
pull it out of that. I love that piece of advice that you give around the work journal. Alfredo, let's hear some questions.
Of course, our first question is from Nick Morgan on LinkedIn. He asks, can you talk about how to identify the UX maturity at a company as a candidate?
Yeah, that's a great question, Nick. I will say there is a ton of like content and writing around this question already out there that you can find. It's not an easy thing to do. And the reason I think it's not easy to do is because some companies don't understand UX maturity. Some companies think they have it when they don't. And when we talk about UX maturity, what we're talking about in my mind, my interpretation, is it's a company that can understand the role design plays holistically and can like leverage or utilize designers in the company to their fullest extent, right? The way that you're going to figure that out is through conversation, asking things about what does design mean in the company? It's a kind of a silly question, but it's something I personally like to ask whenever I'm interviewing. Every single interviewer I talk to, I say, what does design mean to you? You don't have to have a right or wrong answer, but tell me what that means to you. And then other questions around how does design show up in the company? Like when do you have examples of design pushing an initiative or making a change, and what were the implications of that change? Where did that change kind of start? Was it on the design team or was it top down? Those kind of things. I'd say, in my opinion, one of the most obvious ways to detect UX maturity, however, is just to look at the organizational structure. Do they have design leadership at like a top level? Do they have like a VP of design or a design director, or someone that has that kind of presence and hopefully sway? You probably should talk to them in interviewing if you can and get their sense of what design does at the company. If they don't have that, if it's, for example, if it's a startup, again, you're going to try to understand, well, what is the perception of design in this company, and how does design show up every day, and what do people think about when we talk about design? If their perspectives are all misaligned, not a great sign. If they're somewhat consistent and the answers kind of fulfill your own ambitions, that could be a really great sign.
Do you ever ask questions about, the expectation around design output and like cadence of design output? Is that something that you ever factor into UX maturity?
Wow, cadence is such an interesting term. I don't think I've ever thought about cadence in my own career. I think outputs is also not super appropriate in my mind. I think the questions that I will often suggest designers ask, or which I ask myself, are around just general, how is design, like what does successful design look like? And again, that's the kind of question I will ask almost every single person I talk to. What does good design look like? What are the kind of outcomes that design contributes to? And then similarly, particularly if you're interviewing, if you're an interviewer or interviewee, asking what does failure look like? What does a bad scenario look like for design? What would that mean to you?
Great question.
Our next question comes from Carla on LinkedIn. Hi guys, I'm straight out of boot camp with no design experience. I've applied for over 100 jobs, junior through mid. Haven't had any requests for interviews and lots of rejection. Do either of you have a favorite site that shows a great way to set up case studies?
Yeah. First of all, sorry to hear that you're in that situation, Carla. That is certainly not a very fun experience to be in. I will start by saying, yes, Shape is a great place to help you with this. So reach out to me on LinkedIn if you'd like an invite. I'd love to have you, and that can help you. Let me also give a few kind of suggestions here. The first is, whenever I see someone who says I've applied to hundreds of jobs and I'm not getting response, that is like an incredible red flag to me. That tells me you need to optimize a little bit more of what you're searching for. What I mean by that is, if you're applying to hundreds and hundreds of jobs, you're kind of just throwing out a net and hoping that something connects, right? Instead of doing that, try to invest some more of your time doing research on what these companies are looking for, what you have to offer, what you've learned in your boot camp, or what you've learned in other jobs or experiences, and try to find opportunities where your perspective, your beliefs, your principles, and your experiences, even outside of design, have an overlap with those jobs. And then instead of just applying, maybe reach out to the recruiter and apply, or reach out to someone at the company and try to understand, well, what are they really looking for? Because if you're really optimizing your resume, your LinkedIn profile, your portfolio, if you have anything to show at all, maybe from your bootcamp, if you're optimizing that for a singular job or type of job, you don't need to apply to 100. Maybe you apply to 10, 20, maybe 30. You're going to get a lot stronger signal, though, because you're going to be much more focused. Your collateral will be aligned with what these companies are looking for. You're much more likely to get at least an initial conversation. So if you ever find yourself applying to many, many jobs, in my experience, that means that you're not as focused as you need to be. So maybe reconsider that. And then go to a place like Shape or on your LinkedIn and stuff, and get feedback on your portfolio and your resume, and share a little bit about the types of jobs you're applying to. I think that'll really, really help you out.
And the one thing I'd like to add too is, Carla, it is a bit of a numbers game sometimes. So definitely the optimization, but don't get discouraged about it. Is a little, sometimes you got to wait, and it's going to be rejection and rejection and rejection. At least in my experience, I've experienced a heavily lopsided rejection versus exception. And those exceptions are like truly wonderful. And so it is discouraging. Allow yourself to take breaks, take a weekend. Don't just dwell on it all the time and ruminate, and then get back at it. It's a grindstone. The interview gauntlet is what I call it. It very much is a gauntlet. It's the ninja games, right? Where you're walking through the big obstacle course. It is that. And then you find yourself in a great situation, and you can make the most of that. So great question.
Before we get to our next question, I know that a lot of folks have been asking Tanner, what's the best way to get an invite to Shape? Are they able to get an invite? Would you be able to quickly address that before we move on to the next question?
Yeah, of course. Thank you all for the interest. If you'd like to join Shape, I would say you can go to shape.co, shape.co. You can find our LinkedIn or Twitter on the bottom of that website. You can also learn more about what Shape is. And if you go to the LinkedIn or Twitter, you'll see some posts that I've been making inviting people to join. Just reply there, and I can message you from that point on to add you. I will say currently Shape is $20 a month. I'm trying to get the business off the ground. I want to make sure it's supportive. You can unsubscribe at any time, no questions asked, but it is $20 a month. If you'd like a discount for any reason, just let me know as well, and we can try to figure something out.
Awesome. Our next question comes from Paul on YouTube. How many rounds of interviews should be enough for both parties?
I'm kind of giggling here because I don't think there's a straightforward answer here. I really, really don't. I think it depends on the company, the maturity of the company, the role, and I wish more often the designer, the interviewee. I think designers should have a chance to add as many rounds as they want to interviews. If you don't have the information you need to make a decision, you need to keep getting conversations on the calendar. For companies, I've seen everything from 2 interviews where you talk to the founder of the company and maybe a cross-functional peer, and then that's it. In other cases, I've seen as many as 10, which in my experience seems like a lot too many. But again, it just depends on the circumstances. If the company is able to get signal sooner than later, that should be fine. But unfortunately, I don't think there's a straightforward answer here. It really depends on the context.
And it's certainly not uncommon to see 4 or 5 rounds. I think probably 4 or 5. Would you say that that's fairly average based on what you've seen?
Yeah, so this is really interesting because I think during the pandemic, the COVID pandemic, we've seen a little bit of a shift in this, where we used to go from 5 or 6 rounds of interviews to 3 or 4 being the average that I've seen, where you've got a pre-screener call with a recruiter. Sometimes you'll talk to a hiring manager, and then in many cases, jump straight into an on-site loop, which is about 3 or 4 separate interviews.
Good question.
Our next question comes from Ganesh on LinkedIn. Hey, Tanner, Tommy, any thoughts on putting up or discussing projects that didn't see the light of day or that failed?
Ganesh, you should know the answer to this. Yes, share those projects. I mean, those are some of the most interesting projects. And the reason I say that is because if the project failed, I want to know what that meant to you. Why did the project fail? Was it because the team deprioritized it? Did it not meet customer needs? What was it that made the project fail? Or if the project didn't see the light of day, again, I want to know what the cause of that was. Did the executive team decide to move priorities or something? In either case, what really matters is how do you feel about that that endpoint, right? If the project failed, was it super frustrating? Did you do something to try to like overcome that frustration or that stress? Excuse me, like how do you reflect on that failure? What did you learn? What would you do differently? Similarly, with a project that didn't see the light of day, that's okay. The project, quote unquote, success, the completion of the project is not necessarily did it get out and increase revenue or whatever. The end of the project is when you stop working on it. That's what I want to hear. That's what recruiters want to hear is what was the end point for you? Yeah, Tommy, would you add anything there?
Just that, you know, I'd actually be curious to hear, and this will be our final question. Thank you all for your questions. If you do present work and there's maybe this, and the stigma might exist just in my head as the person interviewing, that it failed, quote unquote, or didn't see the light of day. Would you balance that with something that maybe has a different outcome just to show like a contrast?
Are you asking, like, if you had a project that failed, would you try to show a different project that succeeded?
Or that saw the light of day versus didn't see the light of day to show that you've seen both flavors? Do you think that that's important in someone's mind?
Yeah, it's a great question. I'll say two things here. The first is if there was ever like something that was frustrating about a project, which I talked a lot about here, or a project that failed, please keep in mind that you need to be optimistic about the outcome anyway, right? Meaning, don't just say it failed, it was hard, it sucked, I hated it. Tell me like what really kind of worked out for you in that project. I think that's pretty key. The second thing is, yes, when it comes to presenting projects or building a case study or a portfolio, you need to have a broad breadth of your different work experiences. The broader, the better, because people want to hire people who can do things across the board, not just like one or two types of projects. And this is why when you present a case study or present a portfolio, you should always strive to have, in my opinion, 2 projects, never just one. 3 is kind of pushing it. You want 2 that can show a breadth of your experience.
Awesome. And that's it for today. Hey, Tanner, thank you so much for being here. Stick around for one more minute. Alfredo, I appreciate you in the background helping us with this, and everyone else for attending. We will see you next time on the Zero Content Design Show. I will talk to you all later.
Thanks, everybody.